Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 4 of the 5-day Beat Your Cravings challenge. I'm really excited to cover today's topic. And before I get into it, I'm going to just kind of recap what all we have gone over so far. So if you've been sticking with me throughout the week so far, thank you. Hopefully you've been able to make some changes, even if they're just the tiniest little changes, because every little bit counts. And don't forget that you can go back through the teachable format and you can go day by day to make sure that you haven't missed anything. You can go at it at your own pace. You have the Beat Your Cravings manual, which walks you through everything day by day. You have received the emails each day, which you can just save and go back to. And then you also have the 5-day menu to walk you through breakfast, lunch, dinner, snack options. And then with the emails and also each day, there have been some bonus materials. So you have extra breakfast recipes that are blood sugar balancing friendly. You have a food journal template that I introduced to you on day 3. And then today you received a entire booklet of grain-free dinner recipes. And these can be used for lunches as well. But that is what we will be talking more about today, the topic of carbohydrates and why the challenge for today is to swap grains for veggies. So really quick, I will just recap what we've gone over the past 3 days. So day 1, we talked about the importance of building your meals with protein and fats and fiber, and why this is so important for blood sugar balance. Blood sugar imbalances are one of the root causes, not only for cravings, but also for energy slumps, for headaches, for sleep issues, for moodiness, for hunger. So many of the issues that we deal with on a day-to-day basis go back to blood sugar imbalances. So with day 1, you have starting off with your breakfast, building a protein, fat, fiber breakfast, which sets your day up for success and leads you into making good decisions for lunch and for dinner. So that is day 1. Day 2 is about how you're eating. So making sure that you're eating in a relaxed rest and digest state. This is not only important for priming your digestive enzymes and your stomach acid to physically and mechanically break down your food, but it also helps with feeling full and satiated. So not overeating, but also making sure that you're eating enough to keep you full and satisfied for the next 3 to 4 hours. And then day 3 was all about journaling and tracking, but not in terms of calories. So you're not tracking in like a calorie counting app, or you're not tracking points or anything like that. You're just writing down free-handed what you're eating and how you feel around that meal, and more specifically tracking your ACEs. So your appetite, your cravings, your energy, and your sleep. And then you can add digestion to that as well, especially if you deal with bloating or acid reflux or constipation on a daily basis. So that was day 3. And again, you got the template in your email and also on Teachable to download that you can use to help you journal and track and be consistent with that. And even just 5 days can be really, really enlightening and give you a way to look back objectively on what you're doing and connecting how you feel to what you're eating. So that was day 3. And day 4, which is today's challenge, is to swap grains for veggies. And there are a few reasons why we're doing this specifically for this challenge. And I'll get more into the topic of carbohydrates in general. So I think that this challenge for today leads nicely into discussing carbohydrates. And this is one of the questions that I get a lot is, are carbs good? Are carbs bad? Or beyond that, I'll get questions around keto and certain types of diets, so like paleo diet, or even things like Atkins, which are low carb diets. So I will talk a little bit more about that. And then I'm also just going to link to an article that you can read. I go into more depth. This is a little bit more advanced in something that I teach in my metabolic flexibility course. And it's all about how to find your unique carb tolerance. So for simplicity's sake, and this challenge being really simple and straightforward, all we're focusing on is swapping grains for veggies. And that's a great place to start if you've never cut out grains before, especially as we try to increase our protein, increase our healthy fats, and balance our blood sugar. But that article will go in more depth on how to find your unique carb tolerance. And it also goes into figuring out how many carbs are right for you and how it affects your sleep and your energy levels and your blood sugar specifically, because everybody is different with that. And how many carbs you need will depend on your activity levels. It will depend on your hormonal status, which for menstruating women versus perimenopause or menopausal women, there's definitely a difference in the amount of carbs that they might need. And then also those with thyroid or adrenal issues, they might need more carbohydrates as well. But there is a strategy to it. So I'm not saying eat all the carbs all the time. And that's where a more individualized approach comes into play. So let's talk just simply about the difference between carbohydrates as a source of fuel and then fat as a source of fuel. I mentioned this a little bit more in day one as we talked about the protein, fat, fiber combinations for blood sugar balancing meals. But you can think of carbohydrates as your quick, fast-acting sources of energy. So these are like the kindling or the sticks that you put on a fire. So they will give you energy, but they're not long-lasting. Whereas fats are going to be like the log that you put on the fire. So higher in calories, and you can get nutrient-dense sources of fats as well. You're using that for longer sustained energy. So you feel full for longer and your blood sugar is balanced. So you're not causing the release of insulin and your blood sugar isn't spiking and then dropping back down quickly like it does whenever you just have carbohydrates. So a couple of reasons why we want to swap grains for vegetables. And when I talk about grains, I'm talking about bread and, wraps and rice and quinoa. I'm trying to think of other pasta, things that you might eat on a typical basis that are more grain-based. Those are all examples. So also kind of falling into this higher carbohydrate category are legumes. But I didn't want to say swap grains and legumes because it gets a little bit more complex. So just know that both of those fall into like the higher carbohydrate category, and both are going to be more difficult to digest for an impaired digestive system, which a lot of us already have that if we maybe have dieted in the past or been on low-fat diets or even just eaten processed foods, canola oils, and things like that. So the grains are not only inherently harder to digest, especially for an impaired immune system, but they can also be very inflammatory. So if you already have a lot of other signs of inflammation, then those grains can basically add fuel to the fire. And so in an already healthy gut, you might be totally fine with the grains. The best way to prepare them to make them easier to digest, which is basically what's going to help to get rid of the phytic acid and the other anti-nutrients, is to soak and sprout them. And so if you just search, you can look on Google for how to soak and sprout grains. And you can also do this with legumes, with beans and lentils. And you can also do this with nuts and seeds. It makes all of those because they do have, since they are plant sources, their defense mechanism comes in the form of anti-nutrients like phytic acid and lectins. And so the soaking and sprouting process helps to get rid of those, making them easier to digest. So that's a little bit more advanced if you want to properly prepare them that way. But again, for the sake of this challenge, we are really, really simply just going to cut out those grains and crowd them out with nutrient-dense sources of carbohydrates. So you're swapping those carb sources for more nutrient-dense sources, which are going to be your vegetables and your fruit. And in the food guidelines, you'll see a list of veggies and fruits that you can have instead. But some of my favorite starchier veggies to swap out for would be any squashes. So like butternut squash is really good, acorn squash. You can also do spaghetti squash, which actually isn't super high in carbohydrates, but it's a good substitution to get that like texture and feel of actual spaghetti. And then plantains are really, really good. You can get plantains frozen, or you can buy them and slice them up and cook them. Yucca is another really, really good starchy vegetable. Again, you can buy these frozen, or you can buy them from the store and you can peel them and slice them, but they're a little bit more difficult. So I usually recommend getting them already frozen and sliced up. And then also potatoes are a great go-to. So instead of having bread with your dinner, you could swap that out for fingerling potatoes or like roasted red potatoes. You could slice them up in wedges and just roast them. You can do sweet potatoes, Japanese sweet potatoes, purple sweet potatoes, purple potatoes. There are so many potatoes. And you can make these just in different varieties, different versions. So you can mash them, you can roast them, you can fry them in a pan with some avocado oil. Lots of ways to get the benefits of carbohydrates and again, that like quick source energy. But we're buffering these carbohydrates with your protein and fat. So you've already built your meal with protein and fat to stabilize your blood sugar, and then you're adding in these carbohydrates. Again, going low carb too quickly by just completely eliminating grains, especially if you're relying on them a lot, and not increasing your protein and your fat is going to maybe provide benefits initially, and you might see a lot of weight loss and feel like your cravings have improved. But in the long term, especially for women, it can get a lot more difficult, and it can affect our hormones, especially our thyroid and our cortisol levels, which is our stress hormone. So that's why I recommend still having really good sources of carbohydrates and actually figuring out a way to cycle them back in. So for example, I like to do more carbohydrates in the evenings. That works really, really well for me. And then I also do more carbohydrates on days whenever I'm more active. So if I'm doing like a higher intensity workout, then I'll do more carbs in that day. But on a day where I'm resting and maybe I'm just going for walks and things like that, that only require fat as a source of energy, then I'm sticking to mostly protein and fat, and my body isn't under as much stress. So I don't need those quick, easy sources of energy. So you can kind of modify your carbohydrate intake. Again, once you have a good baseline with your protein, fat, fiber combination meals, then you can figure out how to increase and decrease your carbs given that you're eating the right type of carbs. So we don't want to eat processed carbs that are going to cause inflammation, regardless of how many grams of carbohydrates they have, things like chips or like, I don't know, really sugary sweet treats and ice cream and things like that that have a lot of ingredients. Those are going to cause inflammation anyways. So we don't want to have those higher carbohydrate sources. Processed breads and what else are like really processed carbohydrates? I can't even think of them right now. But yeah, processed breads, muffins, bagels, cookies, things like that. We want to mostly avoid those. There is a time and place for them. You can totally incorporate them without completely derailing your blood sugar and your goals. But if you are at breakfast, if you go out for brunch and you have an option between a cinnamon roll or eggs and potatoes, I would rather you have the eggs and potatoes. If you want to feel good the rest of the day, if you want to have the cinnamon roll and then just go home and chill, then take a nap, that's totally fine. But that's kind of how you can like pick and choose when you're having carbs and the type of carb sources that you want to have. And so just keep that in mind as you're making these swaps. The dinner recipes should be really helpful just to give you a better idea. Again, they're like obviously protein and fat combinations, but they have those veggies and they have those greens in there, so that you are still getting the fiber and you're still getting the carbohydrates, and your body isn't in complete shock that you've cut out these carbs completely and it doesn't know what to do or what sources of energy to use because it's not used to using fat yet as a source of fuel. So I hope that makes sense. And even if you just want to make kind of like a list of your go-to starchy carbohydrates. So again, for me, I like having potatoes, like all varieties of potatoes. And I really like doing the frozen yucca. They come in like little fries. I forget the brand of the one that I get, but you can find them at a lot of grocery stores. I like having those on hand. Plantain chips are really easy, good go-tos. Sweet potato chips are also good. So you can figure out like what your go-to sources of starch, your carbohydrates are, so that you can incorporate those. And then everything else is basically, instead of having wraps or bread, or like instead of a sandwich, you're switching that bread out for a couple cups of veggies. So at least half of your plate, if you want to think about starting there, should be made up of veggies. And you can never go wrong with throwing in extra greens. So arugula or romaine lettuce if you want extra crunch. You can do spinach. You can do kale. It is harder to digest. So any of those hardier type of greens are going to be harder to digest. So just keep that in mind. If you have bloating and irregular bowel movements and things like that, I wouldn't go too heavy on the kale. And then sprouts are really, really good. So you could do broccoli sprouts. You can do sunflower sprouts. You do alfalfa sprouts. Those are all just easy to throw into basically any dish that you're making. So you have your greens, and then you have a couple cups of veggies, whatever veggies you've roasted, or it could be in soup form. You could do some cauliflower soup or butternut squash soup or something like that, carrot soup. And then you are not even missing out on the carbohydrates from the grains. And instead, you're just focusing on those nutrient-dense vegetable sources. So I hope that makes sense. And that kind of gives you a couple ideas in addition to the recipes that you have on Teachable. So without getting too much also into how to figure out your unique carb tolerance, just know that that is important and it is a strategy. So I'm not saying that we're going completely low carb for an extended period of time. This isn't like, again, keto, which is really high fat, low carb, which can work for a short period of time, but eventually it's beneficial to incorporate some of those good carbohydrate sources that are not inflammatory. And then also figuring out how it affects your blood sugar specifically and how you feel around your meals. So everybody is different with that too. So I will be sure to share the link to the article, and I'll actually post that in Teachable as well, so you can have it and refer back to it. And then if you have more questions on this topic or on carbohydrates in general, or on swapping grains for veggies, we can talk about that more. And another reason that it might be more beneficial for you specifically to remove grains is if you do have digestive issues or any like gut imbalances, so dysbiosis, bloating, extreme cravings, which is obviously what we're talking about in this challenge. And then inflammation with your skin. So if you're like, if you have eczema or you break out in rashes or something like that, or if you have an autoimmune condition, then those are all reasons to really be more diligent about removing the grains and see how you feel as a result of that. We didn't even get into the topic of gluten, but that is a huge source of inflammation for a lot of people. Also a protein that is very difficult to digest, and whether or not you have celiac, you can still have sensitivities and intolerances to it, again, because of compromised gut function. So when we're taking out grains, we're also taking out gluten. That's a really easy way to just kind of scale back on the gluten intake. So a lot of people find it helpful for that from an inflammatory perspective, in addition to the fact that we're just lowering carbohydrates and helping to support our blood sugar a little bit better. So I know that was a lot of information, but I hope that makes sense for today's challenge. And I would love to hear from you if you want to let me know what swaps you've made so far. So maybe if for breakfast you were having a bowl of oats, if for lunch you were having a wrap or a sandwich, if for dinner you were having pasta, I want to know what you swap those out for and what sources of veggies you're using and enjoying. And what recipes you end up trying from the recipe book. So that's all for today. And I will be sure to put this recording up in the Teachable, and you can watch the recording in Facebook as well. So if you have any questions, definitely just comment there. And I'm happy to come back and answer any of those questions. I also will announce tomorrow in the email for day 5 that I am offering free 20-minute strategy sessions for anybody who's made it this far in the challenge, just to give you the opportunity to talk more about what's going on with you, so what you're struggling with the most, and share, what you've gotten out of this challenge so far, coming up with a strategy for what you're going to do continuing forward after this challenge. I would love to talk more about that as well. And just seeing what other additional support that you might need to help you carry out your goals, to keep the cravings away, and to further support your hormones and your digestion and your energy levels and your sleep and all of those wonderful things that make us feel like our best selves. So you will be able to book that through the link in the email tomorrow, and I will also be sharing it out on Teachable for day 5 as well. So definitely take advantage of that. And that is all I have for you today. So I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.